Hey, Messiah Church, hope you're doing all right today. My name is Ryan Pfendler. I'm the Director of Student and Young Adult Ministries here at Messiah, and I'm so grateful to be here with you today. I am grateful to get out of my house, get out of my self-isolation, and be up here to record this video, and I'm glad to be with you today in your homes or wherever it is that you're watching this. And if you've been a part of our Wednesday night spring training series so far, you might recall that when we were doing it live here in the church, we had some snacks that were a part of the experience. And if you were here live tonight, the snack you'd be getting would be a bag of kettle-cooked potato chips. And I picked this snack because it is the loudest and most distracting snack I can think of. We've all been in a silent room somewhere where somebody's popped open a bag full of these and started crunching. And if you're like me, you better hope that you're not trying to focus on anything important in that moment. But I picked the loudest and most distracting snack I could think of because we're talking tonight about just the opposite. We're talking about the spiritual discipline of silence and solitude. And I picked this practice personally because for me, this was a practice that when we were planning for this series, it was one that I was not naturally good at. In fact, it was one of my weakest spiritual disciplines. And so I wanted to take on this subject to teach you about it in the hope that I would embrace the practice myself, learn some of the benefits of it, and guide you in some of the first steps in taking the approach and the practice of silence and solitude in your own lives. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today, the practice of silence and solitude. And just so you're aware, silence and solitude, two different words, but they are essentially the same spiritual practice. So as I talk to you today, I'm going to use the term silence. I'm going to use the term solitude. Know that I'm essentially talking about the same thing. And so let's start out today with kind of an understanding of what silence and solitude is. And I found a great description of it from the words and the writings of a Benedictine monk, someone who you could pretty much consider a pro at the practice of silence and solitude. And here's what he has to say about it. He says, silence is the moment when a human being merges with the reality of God through prayer. It's the moment when a human being merges with the reality of God through prayer. I love that language. I love that language because that's not the kind of language that we're used to here in the Lutheran Church. Myself personally, I was born and raised Lutheran, and I understand that we are a very much a heady, a very much a scholastic kind of faith, scholastic kind of tradition. But we don't talk a lot about the moments of faith. We don't talk a lot about the experiences of faith. And so this language about merging with God, it's not something that we're used to. But it's the kind of language that we need to start using. Because the truth is, we are now living in a culture that is quite honestly bored with a passive faith. We're living in a culture that is bored with a faith that only offers them weekly consumption of information. That's because we're now living in the digital age. We're living in a time when information is no longer lacking. In fact, we have too much information. We're now struggling from information overload. We are consuming so much information so regularly that our ability to actually retain information is decreasing over time. And so my fear is that if we as a church offer the world nothing more than just more information, if we as a church offer nothing more than just more knowledge, my fear is that it's going to get lost in the shuffle. It's going to get lost in the shuffle of all the other information that we're consuming every hour, every minute of every day. What our culture is telling us, what they've been telling us for decades and what they've probably been telling us for even longer, is that people aren't hungry for just information about God. People are hungry for an experience of God. People don't just want a faith that relies solely on the weekly dispensing of knowledge. They want a faith that gives them moments and experiences that they can point to and say, in this place, in this moment, I experienced the Spirit of God. I was there with him, and you know what? I want to experience it again. And what I'm talking about here, this kind of experiential faith, it is not some new agey thing. This is not some crazy, ungospel-based faith that I'm talking about. I'm not talking about a faith that is based on emotions. The kind of faith I'm talking about is the kind of faith that Jesus Christ himself had. Jesus had a real and experiential faith. And he took that faith and he passed it down to his disciples. And his disciples passed that faith on to the generations to come afterwards, hoping that they would have the same real and experiential faith that they had. And that's the kind of faith that we want you to have here at Messiah. We want you to have a real and experiential faith. That's why I love this series that we're doing, this spring training series, because what we're doing is we're giving you spiritual disciplines and practices that if you were to incorporate them into the rhythms of your life, what you would get are moments where you would merge with the Spirit and the power of the presence of God. And if that's the kind of faith that you want, if you're bored with a passive kind of faith, if you want more in your relationship with God than just consuming information, then I want to tell you tonight about this amazing practice of solitude and silence and show you how it can bring you into the presence of God. We're going to start out tonight by looking at the practice of silence and solitude in the life of Jesus himself. And here's the thing about this practice. For Jesus, this was not a rare practice for him to perform. So often when we think of Jesus, we think of the actions of Jesus. We think of the miracles that he performed, the teachings that he taught, the people that he healed, the children that he welcomed into his embrace. We think of the active, external Jesus. But Jesus did not shy away from taking many, many moments to retreat from the crowds and seek solitude and presence with his Father. And so let's start out by noting that even Jesus Christ himself, even the Son of God, was not on 100% of the time. He needed to take a step back and to rest in solitude. And so this is the kind of practice that Jesus incorporated into the rhythm of his regular life. In fact, if you were to look at the book of Luke, you will see 9 separate examples where Jesus removes himself from the world around him and pursues the practice of solitude. And in case you don't want to count it, in case you don't want to flip through the book and count it on your own, we can find a very well-spoken example of it right here in Luke chapter 5. If you've got your Bibles, you can flip to it right now. We're going to go to Luke chapter 5, verse 15. And here's what the Gospel of Luke says. The report of Jesus' power spread even faster, and vast crowds came to hear him preach and to be healed of their diseases. But Jesus often withdrew to the wilderness for prayer. So what's going on in this scene, what's going on in this passage is early on in his ministry, Jesus starts becoming famous. People start hearing about this healer that is curing people of their diseases, that is casting out demons, and they're saying, you know what, I want in on some of this action because I need some healing myself, or my child needs some healing, or my mother needs a demon cast out of her. And so I'm going to go find this Jesus guy. And in Luke 5, the crowds start coming to Jesus. And so Jesus performs the healing, he performs his miracles, and he responds to this new crowd by retreating and pursuing silence when he's done. And we might look at this passage and think, oh, Jesus, he must be an introvert, right? He wants to get away from the people and pursue time on his own. But personally, I don't think it's very responsible for us to try to categorize the personality of Jesus in such a way. I don't think it's smart for us to try to put the personality of Jesus into the kind of boxes that we put ourselves in. I think what's wiser for us to say, I think what's more accurate to say, is that Jesus was self-aware enough to know when he needed to be with people and when he needed to be on his own. And so this is the first practice of solitude that we see Jesus practicing, is that he responds to the demands of life by pursuing silence and solitude. And for us, solitude is a reactive discipline to the demands of life. There's a few other stories that we see Jesus put this into practice. It's not just this one. Early on in his ministry, there's a time when Jesus has what we'll call a very busy day. In the morning, he's preaching in the synagogues, and by the afternoon, he's healing people, and by the evening, he's casting out demons. A pretty full day, if you were to ask me. Here's how Jesus responds. He goes to bed, and Mark 1 tells us this. It says that before daybreak the next morning, Jesus got up and went out to an isolated place to pray. Here's another example. Let's talk about the day when Jesus got some really bad news, some devastating news. Jesus had just found out that his cousin and one of his best friends, John the Baptist, had just been executed. In this time, Jesus is grieving. He is sad. He is probably overcome with emotion. And here's how he responds to this news. As soon as he heard the news, Jesus left in a boat to a remote place to be alone. In Mark, we see another story. There's this time in the book of Mark, an opportunity where Jesus gets to preach to 5,000 people. In fact, it's not just 5,000 people, it's 5,000 men. And so if we're adding women and children into the mix, that crowd could have been 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 people. And so here's a scene where Jesus is preaching to a mega church, essentially. And when he's done preaching, he goes and he miraculously feeds them all dinner. Now, I don't know what Thanksgiving is like in your house, but this past Thanksgiving, I had the opportunity to go home for the first time in many years, and I got to see my family in action serving Thanksgiving dinner. And it was my family and our extended family, and they were just serving food for 10 people. But I could see the amount of effort and the amount of work they put into this meal and how exhausted they were. And by the time it was all done, by the time we had all eaten, of course, they took their post-Thanksgiving nap on the couch, in their beds, wherever it might have been. Here's a story where Jesus, though, he's not just feeding 10 people, he is feeding 10,000 people, maybe 15,000 people. And when it's all said and done, this is how Jesus responds. After telling everyone goodbye, he went up into the hills by himself to pray. Jesus doesn't respond to this huge task by going to take a nap. And I think we should take note right here, that Jesus seems to find more rest in solitude with God than he does by taking a nap. And so you're starting to see a pattern here. I hope you're seeing that solitude for Jesus, it was not one option amongst many other options. Jesus wasn't sitting around saying, maybe I'll spend time with God today, or maybe I'll kick up with a beer and enjoy some Netflix. That's not the attitude that Jesus takes. When life presents Jesus with big situations, when life presents Jesus with powerful and stressful and major situations, he doesn't respond by going anywhere else but solitude with his Father in heaven. Jesus finds rest in his solitude. Jesus finds comfort. He finds power. He finds renewal in this practice of solitude. And here's what I'm going to say. I'm just going to go ahead and say that if the Son of God himself needs rest and renewal and power from the practice of solitude, you know what? I'm just going to go ahead and assume and believe that I probably need it for myself too. If Jesus responds to the big moments of life through solitude, maybe I need to do the same myself. And so that's the first practice of solitude we're talking about. It is a reactive discipline to the demands of life. But for Jesus, solitude wasn't just a reaction. Let's turn now to the book of Matthew, chapter 4. We're going to look at verse 1. And as you're flipping there, I'm going to tell you a bit about the context of what's happening here. This is early on in Jesus' ministry. In fact, he hasn't really started his public ministry yet. What's going on here is Jesus is preparing for his public ministry, and he's being prepared by God. And so back in chapter 3, what had happened is Jesus had just been baptized. And now we get this story here that happens right after, Matthew 4, chapter 1. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted there by the devil. For 40 days and 40 nights he fasted and became very hungry. Now, growing up, I've read this story. I've heard this story before, and I used to think, man, Jesus, you're pretty impressive here, right? You are going out to face your adversary, Satan. You're going out to be tempted, and you are actually going at it from a place of weakness. You're going out there alone. You're going out there fasting and hungry. You're going out there from a position of deprivation, maybe to test your willpower and to see if you can overcome the power of Satan just through your own power. But let's step back real quick. Because what we're talking about tonight is that solitude isn't actually a place of weakness, but solitude is actually a spiritual discipline that, again, remember, it brings us and merges us with the Spirit and the power of God. And so Jesus isn't going out to be alone to be weak. He's going out to be alone and connect with his Father in heaven. And in fact, we see another spiritual practice happening in the story as well. You might remember a few weeks ago, Pastor Jim told us about the importance of fasting, the practice of fasting. And here again, Jesus is using the practice of fasting not to make himself weak. Just like solitude, fasting is a spiritual discipline that merges us with the Spirit and the power of God's presence. And this restructures this entire passage. This restructures the meaning of this entire passage. Because what we see is that Jesus isn't going out into the wilderness to face Satan from a place of weakness. He's not going out there to face him from a place of deprivation. Jesus is going out there and he is spending 40 days in intentional solitude with his Father in heaven. And he is fasting to connect with the Spirit of his Father so that when that temptation finally comes, when Satan comes and gives Jesus the greatest trial of his ministry, Jesus is spiritually powerful enough to overcome that temptation. Jesus does not go into the wilderness to get weak. He goes into the wilderness to get strength. And through the strength of his spiritual disciplines, he overcomes the greatest trial of his ministry. This passage reveals to us the second way of practicing solitude. The second practice of solitude we see in this passage is that solitude is a proactive discipline that prepares us for the big moments of life. It is a proactive discipline that prepares us for the big moments of life. And I think we need to just sit here on this passage for just a minute. We need to sit here in Matthew 4 on this story. Because what is it showing us? It shows us a story where Jesus is going out to face his greatest adversary. He's going out to face the devil. He is going out to face temptation and trials, the greatest temptation of his ministry. And he could have come out to that temptation. He could have come out to that confrontation and prepared for it any way he wanted to. And Jesus chose to prepare for that trial with the discipline of fasting and the discipline of solitude. I wonder what that tells you about the power of those disciplines. I hope you're starting to see the book-ended nature of this practice. What we see through the rhythms of Jesus' life is that when he was preparing for something big, when he was preparing for something important, Jesus chose the practice of solitude. And when the big moments happened, and when he was recovering from them and processing them and in need of rest and in need of renewal, Jesus pursued the practice of solitude. Maybe now you're starting to get it. Maybe now you're starting to see it. Maybe you're saying, okay, Ryan, if you had just come to me talking about solitude all on your own, I wouldn't necessarily have believed you, but I'm seeing it happen in the life of Jesus, and I guess maybe it's pretty important, right? Maybe you get it now, but here's the thing. You're saying, Ryan, I see the power of solitude, but I don't have the time. I just don't have the time to practice it in my own life. And I get it. We're all busy. We've got spouses, we've got children, we've got jobs, we've got clubs, we've got sports, we've got hot yoga class. We've got any number of things that are keeping us busy in this life. And you know what? Even now, in this weird transition that we're going through, even now, a lot of that stuff might be out of the way, but we probably don't feel less busy. In fact, we're probably feeling just as busy adjusting to this new rhythm of life. We're still learning what it's going to be like. And before you know it, it might be over, and then we're readjusting back to those other rhythms of life, and we're just as busy all over again. And so I think for us, busyness is probably the number one hindrance to introducing any sort of spiritual practice into our lives. But I think we need to be honest with ourselves about how we really spend our time. We say we don't have enough time, but let's really look at our time. Because how often do we come home from a stressful day at work and our response is to pop open a few beers and watch some reruns of The Office? How often is our response to a bad day at school to go off and isolate ourselves in our rooms, get under the covers and scroll through Instagram and scroll through TikTok for hours on end with no goal in mind, with no end in sight? We're just scrolling and scrolling and scrolling until 2 hours have gone by. How often do we face an attack on our self-confidence? And we respond by going to the world, or we respond by going to dating apps, and we swipe and we swipe and we swipe because we want to see that someone likes us. And when we go to these dating apps, we want to see that someone can connect with us. And our hope is that, hey, if someone likes me, if someone thinks I'm cute, then I must be valuable. And here's the thing. These habits, these practices, they aren't necessarily evil. They're not necessarily sinful. In fact, sometimes they can be good. Sometimes we plug into a TV show or a movie and we become creatively inspired through it. Sometimes we scroll and spend time on social media and we discover a community, we discover a group that we connect to that we couldn't have connected to otherwise. Maybe we swipe right on someone and we connect with them and we start dating them and we end up marrying them. There's good to become from some of these things. But if we're being honest to ourselves, most of the time these things leave us feeling pretty empty. And most of the time these things are nothing more than distractions. Ways to numb us to whatever it is that brought us to that place. Ways to distract us from the insecurities and the feelings and the frustrations and the anger that made us want to run away. And so we binge watch, we scroll, we swipe, and when we're done with those things, we come back to reality, and the problem that brought us there is still there. Most of us don't even really know how much time we spend on our phones or binging on television. And most of us probably don't even want to know how much time we spend doing those things. And if you don't want to know how much time you spend doing those things, I'm sorry to say I'm here to give you the facts. I'm going to tell you right now how much time the average person spends on these habits. The average American, statistically, spends 5 hours of their day on their phone. Now, maybe you see that statistic and you scoff a bit and you say, nice, well, I don't spend that much time on my phone, Ryan. Okay, let's look at television time. The average American spends 5 hours a day watching television. Now, I want to put this into a more concrete way of understanding it. Our typical day, right, is about 16 hours of time spent awake. Right? 16 hours of our time is spent awake, 8 hours of sleep. I know not all of us get 8 hours of sleep, but let's just, for the sake of this argument, say we spend about 16 hours awake every day. What that means is that when you put these numbers together, what this means is that the average American spends 114 days of their year on their phones and 114 days of their year watching television. I don't know if we have a time problem, but I think we definitely have a problem with how we spend our time. I was listening to a guy talk once about vineyards. He was talking about how wine is made, and if you're not familiar with the process, there's a part in this process called pruning. And what that is when they go out and they trim away a third of the grapes off of the vine. Some of those grapes might be bad, but actually a lot of those grapes that they trim off are good grapes. There's nothing necessarily wrong with those grapes, but they have to trim away those grapes. They have to trim away a third of the grapes so that the rest of the grapes can grow to be even better. I think God might need to do some pruning in our lives. And he might need to trim away some bad things. And he might even need to trim away some good things. But he's trimming away those things so that he can offer us a better thing. So if you're concerned about the time, do I have the time for this practice? Here's the questions that we should ask ourselves. What if we replaced moments of distraction with moments with God? What if we replaced bad habits with good habits? What if we replaced good things with better things? This is the opportunity that God offers us. And if that's what you want, I want you to think about what your life might look like if God were to prune away the bad things and replace them with good things. If he were to prune away the distractions and replace them with his presence. If he were to prune away the good things and give you better things. I wonder if you'd become more of the person that you want to be. And so if that's what you want, if you want to replace those bad things, if you want to prune away the bad things and the distracting things and the good things so that God can give you better things, let me tell you about this amazing practice of silence and solitude and where to start with it. What are some first helpful steps in walking down the path of this spiritual practice? My first helpful tip, the first thing that I found helpful in pursuing silence and solitude is to ritualize it. Make it special. Incorporate something that sets a mood. So for me, oftentimes, I start out in the morning and I do it with a cup of coffee. I brew it, I prepare it, and as I'm preparing it, I'm preparing my mind and my heart for the solitude that I'm about to experience and the time with God that I'm about to experience. As I'm sitting there and sipping it and enjoying it, I might sit there for 15 minutes. I might sit there for 30 minutes. I might sit there longer and make myself another cup. Another way, maybe you're not a morning person. Maybe you're more of a night person. Grab a little wine. Pour yourself a glass. And sit at a table, sit in a chair. And as you enjoy the sweetness and the flavors of that wine, enjoy the sweetness and the moment that you're experiencing in the presence of God. And so that's step one. A piece of advice number one, ritualize the experience. Hint number two, step number two, once you've ritualized it, prepare your mind. Now, it can be tough if you're going from doing 1,000 things in a day, right? If you're doing this practice, especially at night, it can be tough to go from doing 1,000 things in one day and then sitting down and trying to embrace the silence, right? Our bodies in that moment, we might be still, but our minds are still thinking a million things at once. And so take the time to prepare your mind and prepare your heart. And two great ways to do that are to either maybe pick a worship song, pick some music that can prepare your mind, or maybe pick a verse or two from Scripture and dwell on that and listen to it. Now, I'm not saying to take 30 minutes and worship for 30 minutes and call that your solitude time. I'm not saying to read 3 chapters of the Bible and call that your solitude time. What I'm saying is use these in small ways to transition your mind from on to present. Put on that song that speaks to your heart. Read that verse that's been on your mind for a while. Read your life verse. Spend some time doing that and transition yourself from being on to being present. And finally, once you've ritualized it, once you've performed the ritual, once you've prepared your mind, you are now in the zone of solitude and silence. And in that space, let God lead. A couple weeks ago, we talked about the practice of prayer, and our tendency as humans is to want to compartmentalize things, right? And so if we talked about prayer as one spiritual discipline 2 weeks ago, and we're talking about solitude this week, then they must be two separate things that don't overlap. That's not true at all, because all prayer really is connection with God. But there is a difference between the kind of prayer we talked about before and the kind of prayer we experience in solitude. Before, we talked about the kind of prayer where we are going to God and we are kind of leading the conversation. We're asking God questions. We're telling him what's on our mind. We're thanking him. We're praising him. We are the ones in control. When it comes to our time in solitude, though, this is a time for God to be in control. And so don't come at him leading the conversation, but instead spend some time listening. It's okay to have a question. But rather than telling God what you might want, I think a better attitude to take is to say, okay, God, this is on my mind, this is on my heart. What do you want for me in this? What are you trying to say to me right now? Mother Teresa has a great quote where she was interviewed by a reporter. And the reporter asked her, what does your prayer life look like? What do you ask for God? And Mother Teresa said, I don't say much. I just sit and I listen. And the reporter responded by saying, okay, great. So what does God say to you as you're listening? And she says, not much. He mostly just sits and listens to me. That's the kind of attitude and the kind of prayer and the kind of presence that we get through the practice of solitude. And what you're going to get through this practice is time where you are merged with the reality of the power of God. And I think if you start incorporating this into the rhythms of your life, you're going to want to do it again. And you're going to want to do it again. For me, personally, for myself, I'm very much an extrovert. I love being around people. That is my good place. That is my happy place. But I'm telling you right now, I've had moments recently where I have been with people, I've been in my good place, and I've thought, you know what, I kind of want to go home and spend some time with God. 23-year-old me would have never said that, but here I am, wanting to replace the good thing in my life with the better thing that God is offering me. And so my prayer for you, as you begin to take the steps in introducing the practice of solitude in your life, if you begin to introduce that practice into your life, my hope is that it can be so powerful, it can be so real for you, that you know that God is in the room with you, and that the experience is so captivating that you're going to want to go there again.